Hey guys, so today we're going to start setting up our day and night cycle. And once again, although this is part of the Farming RPG series, everything we do for this system will work on its own. We're going to be creating an entirely new object, so you should be able to use this for different projects. Of course, we'll be adding in some functionality regarding the farming side of things, like getting our crops to become a day older every day and grow when appropriate. And we're going to be doing this day cycle in 2 parts. Today, we're basically just going to set up the time and a few visual cues to help us track the time. And we'll also get our crops to grow at the end of the day. And in the next video, we'll be implementing a kind of basic lighting system that will go with the day and night cycle. So we can have the light cycling through different colors and different opacities depending on the time. So let's get started. And the very first thing we're going to do is set up a new object called day cycle. And this is going to be one of our special system objects that's going to be persistent, and it's going to be handling everything to do with the day-night cycle. So let's just come into our initializing room before we forget and add the day cycle to it. Okay, now let's come into its create event and set up our system. So I'm going to have seconds, minutes, and hours, and we don't really need minutes and hours, but it's just going to make tracking the time easier on ourselves so that we don't have to keep converting back and forward between seconds and hours. And I'm going to set up a day, and we're going to just start with the date being 1. And I'm going to have seasons as well. You might want to put months, and I'm also going to have year. So we're starting on day 1, season 1, and year 1. And basically, I'm going to have a system similar to Stardew Valley, basically because it's just very simple. So I'm going to have 30 days in each season, and there's going to be 4 seasons in each year. So depending on how you have set up your game, you might change these around a little bit once we get to coding. So next, I'm going to have what I'm going to call the time increment. And this is going to be the number of game seconds per step or frame. And what that means is we could make our clock exactly like real life. And to do that, we would have to be saying with every frame of the game, and remember, because there's 60 frames in a second, we want it to be incrementing a fraction of a second each frame. And that exact fraction would be 1 divided by 60. So that 60 frames times 1 over 60 will get us our 1 second. So we would put 1 over 60 if we wanted to do that, but obviously that would make our clock incredibly slow, and especially while we're just testing, we want a much higher number than that. So I'm actually going to put 1,000. And we'll tweak this later for getting it right for the game feel, but we'll just keep it as this for now. Next, what I'm going to have is darkness. And basically what we're going to be doing to indicate how dark it is we're basically just going to be drawing a rectangle over the screen, and that rectangle is going to have an opacity between 0 and 1. And that just corresponds to its alpha value, which is, of course, is between 0 and 1. So if we are at 0 alpha, that means we are completely transparent and invisible. And if our alpha is 1, we are fully opaque. So darkness is going to be rotating between 0 and 1 as the time goes on. For this video, just so that we can have a visual cue of the time, I'm just going to make the darkness progress from 0 to 1, starting at the very start of the day at 12 a.m. and then going on to, again, 12 a.m. at night the next day. Next, I'm going to have the light color, and I'm going to set that to black for now, and that's just going to be the color of the rectangle. And we'll be playing around with this in the next video, but we'll just set it up like that for now. Finally, there's a couple ways we could be drawing our rectangle. So we could draw it in the draw event, and we could just draw it over the view itself. We don't need to be drawing it over the entire room because that's kind of a waste of drawing and resources. All we need to do is draw it over the view. So the location of that rectangle would have to be relative to the view. Another way we could do it is just use the draw GUI event, because the graphical user interface will cover the entire screen anyway. So if we just draw the rectangle over that, that will fill up the entire screen as well. So to do that, we need to be getting just how big our GUI is. So I'm going to have GUI width, and we're going to get it. So display get GUI width, and we'll do the same for the height. Okay, and we'll come into the step event and actually get everything incrementing. So first off, we're going to increment the time. And so we just have seconds going up in whatever time increment, right? So it's incrementing whatever we set here every single step or frame of the game. And now let's just make our minutes and hours dependent on whatever the seconds is. And we have to think, how many seconds are in a minute? 60, right? So let's say we're currently on 120 seconds. How do we get the number of minutes from that? We just divide by 60, right? So we just go seconds over 60. And the same for hours, right? Because there is 60 minutes in an hour. All right, so that should take care of our variables. Now what we're going to do here is change the value of the darkness. So I'm going to say darkness. And remember how I said I wanted it to be changing between 0 and 1 and basically just getting darker and darker as the day goes on. So I'm just going to have our darkness equal the number of hours over 24. So that way, at the very start, let's say we're at 1 a.m., it's going to be 1 over 24. So that's going to be quite a low opacity, so it's not going to be very dark. And as we get closer and closer to 24, we will get closer and closer to 1. So that's going to make it darker. Okay, the next thing we do, I'm just going to call this a cycle check. And what this is going to do is basically check, once we get to 24 hours, we have to reset the clock back to 0 and then increment the number of days. So this is how we're going to get our calendar moving up all the time. So we're going to go if hours is larger than or equal to 24, because I want it to reset as soon as it hits 24 hours, right? As soon as it hits 12 o'clock at night. So once that happens, I want to reset seconds to 0, and I don't have to reset minutes or hours because they're already dependent on seconds here. So once that hits 0, these will also be hitting 0. But what I do want to do is increment the day. And just so you know, I'm using greater than or equal to because our time increment might not be a nice neat number that lets us hit exactly 24. It might shoot over 24 and be 24.1 or something. So this will just make sure that once it is over 24, it will reset the clock. But of course, that is not enough because we also want to be checking if our number of days hits 30 so that we can have a new season. And then again, once we've hit 4 seasons, we want to increment the year. So let's go if day is larger than 30. And I'm saying larger than 30 because I want it to have a day 30, right? I want it to start at day 1, and go and have the day 30. And only when it hits 31 do I want it to reset. So once it hits a day that's greater than 30, we're going to reset day to 1 and increment the season. And exactly the same logic here. If season is greater than 4, then reset the season to be 1 and increment the year. And we're not going to have a cycle check for the year because we just want to have that as infinite. Obviously, you might want to alter this to suit your game, but I just want to keep it as simple as possible. All right, so that is all of our setup. The next thing we're going to do is just draw some things so that we can visualize all of these changes. So firstly, let's just draw our light. Well, actually, it's going to be the darkness, more like. So like I said, it will be a rectangle and I'm going to have this as a certain color. And that color is going to be whatever this variable here is. So for its position in the room, we're going to start at the top left corner of the draw GUI. So that will be 0, 0. And then for X2 and Y2, that will be the bottom right of the rectangle. That's going to be the GUI width and GUI height. And for the color, so that is going to be whatever our light color is. And just so I don't have to type it out 4 times, I'm just going to have a variable C for color equal to our light color. And I'm going to write CCC here. And finally, so for the outline, this is asking us, do you want me to draw the rectangle as an outline or do you want it completely filled in? So we do not want it to be an outline, we want it filled in, so we put false. Now, we can't change the alpha with this function, but we can set the alpha of the entire draw event. So we're going to draw set alpha, and I'm going to set this to our darkness value. That is going to be determining how transparent or opaque our darkness layer is. And of course, whenever you alter anything about the draw event, you have to remember to change it back because I don't want to change the drawing of anything that comes after this. So draw set alpha back to 1. And you don't have to do this, but I'm going to do this just so that you can see what all of our variables are doing. So I'm going to draw text color, all of the variables. And I'm just going to draw them all yellow, let's say. And if you're wondering why I put string here, that's because when we draw text, when we use the function like this, it is asking for a string to draw. And remember, a string is something like this, which has these quotations here. That is going to be a string. But our seconds variable is a number. So we have to convert that to a string. And I'm just going to do this for all of the other variables as well. And of course, just changing where we're drawing it, the y value here, and all of our variables. Okay, and let's run the game and have a look. So there we go. We're getting the seconds incrementing the minutes, and the hours and the number of days is going up. So obviously this isn't how light actually works, but this is just a very simple visual cue for us. We'll change this in the next video. So that's good enough for now. So what we're going to do next is make our crops grow once we hit 24 hours. So right here, we're also going to be telling the crops object to go ahead and make all of our crops older. And the way we're going to do this is I'm going to tell the crops to run an event. So if we come here, and that event is going to be, we could use an alarm, but just for something different, I'm going to come into other and then user events, and we can set up our own event here. And I'm just going to hit user event 1, and we'll do all of that in here. So remember in our step event, when we were tapping G, we were making the crops grow older. We can use this exact code right here, obviously without the G press, to make our crops grow. So we'll just get rid of this, but that all should be fine. But this is only going to make sense if we're in the farm room. But what if we were, for example, in the house and we have the clock hit 24 hours? Then there won't be any crops for it to increment. But I do want the crops in the world to be getting older, even if we're not in the farm room. And to do that, we're going to have to be altering our crops data grid that we set up. So remember, whenever a room ends, we were saving all of our crops to our crops data grid here. And we're saving the number of days old in column number 4, which of course is column 3 because we start at 0. So what we're going to do is basically, so in the case that if the room that we're currently in is equal to the farm room, then we will do it this way. So I'm just going to tab this over. But otherwise, if we're not in the farm room, we will be looping through our grid and incrementing the number of days old of all of the crops saved in there. So remember, in this grid, every single row is a new crop. So we do need to check though that there is actually something in the grid. There might be no crops there. So we first have to check if the grid is empty. And if you recall, what we're doing if the number of crops was 0 is we're just clearing all of the spaces in the grid to be -1. So we just need to check if that cell of the grid, which is just cell 00, if that is not equal to -1, which it will be if there are no crops there. So if it's not -1, we know there is something in there. We're not sure exactly how many yet, so we will need to get how many crops are in the grid. And we can do that just by getting the height of the grid, right? The number of rows, because however many rows there are, we know each entry is going to be a new crop. So we just need to get the height, so H for height equals to the DS grid height of our data grid. And now we're going to loop through it and increase the days old of all the crops. And remember again, that is this slot for all of our crops, column number 3. So I hope you're getting used to our looping through of the grid. So we're going to use the same kind of format as we have before. So starting at the first row, which is going to be our YY, we're going to repeat and loop through all of our rows, and that's going to equal height, so because that's the number of entries. Every time we loop, we're going to increment the row that we're on, and we're going to go ds crops, data, an x and y value. So the x value is going to be 3. That's the column that we're in, the days old column, and the y value is going to be whatever YY currently is. And we're just going to increment that value. So there we go. So we have set up this event, but the day cycle has to actually tell the crops when to run it. So let's head back to the day cycle. And right here, we're going to go with the crops objects, and we're going to have it run its user event 1. So event perform, and we have to give it a type and a number. So every time I use this, I actually have to open up the documentation and have a look at what everything is called. And you can see that our user event, it actually comes under EV other, and then we have to tell it which user event. So the type is like one of these, and then the number is whatever user event. So we put EV other and then EV user, and we had 1. Okay. So that should be it. Let's run the game. And let's quickly plant a few crops. So they're growing properly, as you can see, but let's leave the room and wait for a few days and see what happens. And we might see one of the bugs that I mentioned earlier that we're going to have to fix. So if we come back, so you can see that it has worked, they have grown, but if you caught the middle crop being invisible for a second, if I just leave and come back in, you can see sometimes our crops are disappearing, and that's actually because of a bug from earlier. And that is located here in the room start. So remember, when we leave the room, we save all of the data, and then when we re-enter, we actually respawn all of the crops. So once we've actually respawned them, they're just a dirt pit, so we needed a way to get them to grow to their current days old. So, and what I did was I just copied and pasted this basically into the start. I tacked that on at kind of the end of the video and didn't think much of it, but this code actually contains an incrementing for the number of days old, which is not what we want to do when we're entering the room again, right? So if we go into the house and then come back out and it's still the same day, we don't want it to be growing older. That makes no sense. And it's actually that code that was causing the problem for us, because for the crop that was at the very end that had hit its maximum growth stage, we were still incrementing its days old further. And if you remember how we were drawing the crops, we were kind of going along our sprite here. What actually has happened is it has incremented past its maximum growth stage and it is drawing nothing. So it's appearing invisible. So that is our problem. So if we come back to crops, we need to alter this a little bit. So we don't need this, and we actually don't need this if check here either, because basically what we want to do when we enter the room, we want it to update its growth stage, which is what this code here was doing. So we want it to do that every time. So we can get rid of that, and I'm going to hit Shift Tab to make that come back. And now for this bit of the code, I don't want an else statement. I'm going to change this to an if statement, because what this is doing is saying, so say we've re-entered the room and we have it at its proper growth stage. Now I want to say if our growth stage is at the maximum growth stage, then we want to do all of this stuff. We want to set the growth stage to its max. We want to say that it's fully grown, and we want it to do our little sparkle. So we put in here, if our growth stage is larger than or equal to max growth stage. So again, just using this larger than or equal to just for some reason, if it's going over its maximum growth stage, then we are doing all of this. And now we're not incrementing it anymore. So that should have fixed our problem. Let's try that again. So plant a few crops and we'll leave, and we'll wait here for a few days. Okay, and we'll come back out, and there we go. So that has fixed our problem. We're not getting any disappearing crops. Okay, good. So there's a few more things I'm going to set up. So if you notice, when we're inside the house, we were still getting our light, which is not what I want. I don't want the daylight getting into any of the regions when we're inside. So what I'm going to do is disable the drawing of this stuff here if we are inside. So I'm going to set up a variable called draw daylight. And I'm going to set this false by default. And then at the start of every room, I'm going to have it check if we are in an outside room, then we're going to set it to true. And if we're in an inside room, we're going to set it to false. So we could use an if statement for this, but I'm actually going to use a switch statement. And what this is going to do is basically we're going to say whatever this value is equal to, and then we're going to set up a bunch of cases. So in the case that room is equal to the farm room, or in the case that it's equal to the forest room, I'm going to set draw daylight to be true. And then I'm going to break. And breaking basically will quit this switch statement. So in the case that it is the farm room and we haven't put anything here, we haven't put a break and we haven't told it to do anything, it's just going to come right down to the next case and do this until it finds a break statement. So what this allows us to do is just put for all of the times where we want it to be true, we can just keep listing them like this. So if you've got other rooms that are outside, just list them all here like that. And then I'm going to have what's called a default. And this is if it doesn't find any of these to be true. So anything that isn't outside is going to be an inside room. Then we set draw daylight to be false. Okay, and now we actually have to prevent this drawing. So what I'm going to say is here, I'm going to have if draw daylight, and I can write just if draw daylight like this because this will be either true or false. So if it finds it to be true, it will go ahead and do this, but otherwise it's not going to do that. So if I run the game again, and I come into here, we're not getting any change in daylight, but it should still be changing it if we come outside. So you can see, there we go. Okay, one final thing I'm going to do just so we can manage the day cycle is I'm going to set up a way for us to pause the time. And we might want to do this in game, for example, when we open the inventory or something. But especially for us, just while we're creating the game, we might want to just turn off this day cycle. So I am going to have a variable called time pause. And by default, I actually might want to make that true so that when we run the game, time pause is automatically true, which means it is paused, which means nothing is going to be changing until we play the time. So in the step event, what I'm going to have is a toggle for the time pause. So if keyboard check pressed, so if I hit the T button, I'm going to toggle our time pause value. So whatever it is equal to, I'm going to set it equal to whatever it's not. And we've used this logic before, but just to remind you, what this is going to do is if time pause is currently equal to true, this is going to set it to not true, which is false, and vice versa. So it's just toggling it. So now if time pause is true, so if the pause is true, if we're paused, then we don't want to do any of this. So I'm going to say, we could wrap all of this in a condition, or we could just say if time pause. So if that's true, just exit the code block, right? So we're not going to get any of this incrementing. Okay, so again, let's just test that out. Right, so by default, nothing is happening with the time, but if I press T, I can pause and unpause. Okay, so that is just about it for the day cycle, but I do want to fix one last bug. If we have planting mode open and then we exit the room, we get this error. And that's because the way we've set up everything with some of our data structures and draw events and everything, we are dependent on us being in the farm room. And we don't want to be planting inside anyway. We only want to be planting if we're in the farm room. So we need a way to turn off planting mode if we're not in the farm. So let's come into the crops. And basically I'm going to, so similar to what we just did, I'm going to say if the room is not equal to room farm, I'm going to turn our planting toggle right here. And this is what was allowing us to plant. So when we hit the P button, we turn planting to true. So I'm going to turn this off whenever we are not in the farm room. So planting equals false. And I'm also, after that, I'm just going to exit the script. So that will turn it off every single time. Basically, so none of this code is going to run. We can't toggle it because we've exited it here. And if it was true, when we entered the room, it's going to turn it off immediately. So we're never going to run any of this. We're never going to draw it because the step event runs before the draw event. So that should get rid of any errors that we're having. So let's run that and see. So we'll turn on planting and exit, and there we go. And then when we re-enter, we are no longer planting. All right. So in the next video, we'll be continuing what we have done in this episode, and we'll be doing more of the lighting. So that is the end of today's video. Thanks to everyone on Patreon who are supporting me to make these tutorials. And a special shout out to 3D Monkey Biz and Uthelian. Thanks guys for watching. I hope you're all well, and I'll see you next time.